So welcome to this webinar, which is main purpose is to share the sort of interim results of an applying and advancing knowledge grant that we've got, looking at the opportunities and barriers to entering voluntary carbon markets. This is a project that's being led by UNEP WCMC, working alongside FFI and RSPB, and it got underway last year. As we can see from the number of people in the room, this is an area where there's lots of interest from restoration and conservation organisations. We know from the other work that WCMC and RSPB are doing that there are significant climate change benefits of ELP projects. And so there's lots of potential for projects like yours to have significant benefits in terms of sequestering greenhouse gases and potentially accessing finance through those. However, alongside those opportunities, there's also a lot of confusion about the best way for projects to engage in carbon markets. So I think it's really great we have this project, which is really working to clarify this process and make explicit some of the costs and barriers involved. And it's planning to produce things like guidance for projects, tools to calculate the costs and benefits of selling carbon on the voluntary markets, and some case studies. I think they've been reaching out to many of you to understand your experiences of trying to engage with this world. And this has informed the development of the output so far. And the webinar today is really a key opportunity for you all to give more feedback on how these outputs are shaping up, to really ensure the final products are as useful to you as they can possibly be, in understanding how and if you should be engaging with these voluntary carbon markets. So I just really encourage you to use this as an opportunity to ask questions, give feedback, share your thoughts, to really ensure these products are the best they can be. So without further ado, I will hand over to Megan and Collie, who are going to kick off with an introduction, I think. Thank you.
So I'm Megan. I'm a program officer at UNEP WCMC in our nature-based solutions program, and I've been leading this project from our end. I'm just going to start with a bit of an introduction to voluntary carbon markets and their relevance to restoration projects. And then we're going to quickly run through some of our project findings at the moment, discuss some of our project outputs, and then there'll be a chance for some breakout rooms to split into some specific themes to have a look at those outputs in more detail and give some feedback as well before we all come back to plenary as well. So first off, some quick background and recap on landscape restoration and voluntary carbon markets. So landscape restoration occurs in various forms, but they all have the potential to simultaneously improve livelihoods and well-being, enable biodiversity conservation, and enhance carbon sequestration and storage. And as we approach 2030, the importance of achieving these outcomes at scale is ever increasing. And in Europe, the pressures on remaining intact ecosystems remain high, and large amounts of land continue to be degraded. So rapidly increasing the flow of finance into restoration projects is greatly needed. Historically, these interventions have been highly dependent on funding from grant mechanisms or donations, and increasingly projects are also looking to diversify their funding as a means to scale up and support their long-term maintenance. So this can include payments for ecosystem services, ecotourism, and developing nature-based enterprises. But this is also where voluntary carbon markets can come in. So these markets work by providing a mechanism to enable the flow of private sector finance into projects which are working on the ground. So in an ideal world, the solution would be win-win, where carbon finance would enable restoration activities to happen, and then the credits could be used to offset emissions which couldn't be reduced as part of a buyer's decarbonisation approach. So over the course of this project, we've been interviewing ELP projects, other European restoration projects or groups, standards, as well as some intermediaries to try and understand what the key barriers and opportunities are for restoration projects who are looking to enter the voluntary carbon markets, and their sort of key questions as well. So the outputs of this project are aiming to try and help answer some of these questions, as well as providing tools and examples to do so. And this should help projects to determine their options based on the context of their project.
So this project is focused on voluntary carbon markets in Europe. Historically, carbon markets have been dominated by small or large carbon standards, such as VCA and the gold standard. And the forestry and land projects under those standards have been predominantly based in the tropics. It is because ecosystems in the tropics are larger and have higher carbon stocks, but also lower labor costs, which can make projects to work on the higher upfront cost of these standards. In addition, many of these projects are for deforestation and sustainable forest management, which have low implementation costs and cover large areas in restoration projects. But in the last decade, domestic carbon standards in Europe have been increasing rapidly. The standards are often designed to cover limited types of ecosystems or restoration interventions to meet national emission reduction targets by facilitating the buying and selling of credits in the country. These domestic standards try as possible to explore ways to cut down some of the high costs associated with large carbon standards. Through the simplification of validation requirements and developing methodologies based on local data and context. The buyers are interested in local projects and willing to pay higher price for those domestic carbon projects. Despite the challenges of domestic carbon standards, there's this fragmented nature of the market which makes them challenging to navigate. There are risks when engaging with carbon standards at the early stages, but also risks when getting the best deal from buyers or third parties. Buyers are more familiar with global standards and less familiar with domestic standards, so they are willing to engage with large global standards. The standard are not aware. So if this figure explore carbon standards in Europe, these standards are usually focused on one ecosystem, such as forests, peatland, or agricultural soils. Blue carbon is the focus of several standards now being implemented on investigated. Even though the coverage of standards is fragmented, the methodology could be adopted and modified to suit national context. So at the end, during the blue carbon, we actually throw a database of relevant standards. We actually developed a database containing relevant standards that we can use to understand how to turn this voluntary carbon. So we'll talk to the database during the previous. Thanks.
Great. So carbon markets are also not as simple as just looking at buyers and sellers. There's also a number of intermediaries who are involved in the process of developing projects, verifying and selling the credits. So in a perfect world, they would function to funnel those large sums from the private sector into restoration projects in ways which result in real climate and biodiversity benefits. However, there can be some less than perfect actors and governments of these markets can be quite weak. So it's really important for projects to understand who these different groups are, why and when they should be engaging with them, and the terms of reference for doing so. So we're developing a primary report, which can also give more detail on these different groups and when projects might need to engage with them. And in Europe in particular, groups like brokers or project developers in particular are proliferating really rapidly. And some of these groups can apply markups to their costs, which are largely unknown to projects and could limit the flow of money into those restoration projects as well. So although project design can vary by standard, methodology, ecosystem, or the location of a project, they don't tend to differ substantially from the process that we've outlined here. So generally, projects need to develop their idea and conduct a feasibility study to understand whether developing a carbon project is a sensible option for them. So if they then decide to move forward, a project design document needs to be completed. And this is often done with the help of a carbon project developer or a consultant. To then register the project with their chosen standard, they must then approve the document, and then the project can move forward into implementation with ongoing monitoring and regular verification points to then issue the credit. The length of a carbon project can also vary according to the chosen standard and their methodology, but typically projects tend to range from about 30 to 100 years. And it can take several years just to get to the point of implementing the work, and even around 10 years before the first credits can actually be verified. But this doesn't mean that projects can't see any income for those first 10 years, as there can be options to do things like pre-selling credits, as well as multiple options for financing upfront costs, which will be discussed later. And then throughout the project, we've also been raising the questions of opportunities and barriers with yourselves and other projects. And as you can expect, the potential for new funding, which can diversify project income and reduce reliance on grants or donations, is a significant benefit for participating in these markets. And in doing so, projects can demonstrate their climate benefits whilst also establishing private sector partnerships through the sale of their credits. However, there's also a number of barriers which projects would need to carefully evaluate and navigate. So in the context of Europe, these markets are relatively new and they're growing quickly. And this can make it difficult to understand options and key players. So capacity to do this has been raised as a key issue. One option to address this is working with third parties such as project developers, but this can also carry its own risks, and projects need to ensure their values are aligned. Carbon markets can also risk incentivizing restoration, which prioritizes carbon, and this could be a significant risk for biodiversity and local communities. However, projects which also demonstrate these co-benefits could raise the price of the credits that they sell, and they can also choose to work with standards or groups who promote nature-based solutions. The high cost of designing and implementing a carbon project can also be a significant barrier. But there are options for financing these risks, which we'll go into. And then there's also no rules for pricing carbon credits, and they're often sold for a value which doesn't really reflect the restoration costs and benefits. However, doing things like having a strong story about your restoration and the multiple benefits can really improve prices. And then furthermore, buyers themselves might not be aligned with project values. And there are risks around credits being used for things like greenwashing, which can risk a project's reputation. But although that's a long and also non-exhaustive list of buyers, there are also opportunities for overcoming them, and most of them just require some careful planning and resources. So this project's also been looking in detail at the key steps along the process and the questions which potential carbon projects should be asking. And the sorts of resources which they need to answer them. So we've tried to sort of summarize this in the form of decision trees, which can be used for early scoping, as well as a guide which takes the users through a hypothetical project, sort of demonstrating the thought process behind the different decisions, as well as the kinds of costs that they need to be considering. So one of the main pieces of advice that we've gotten from other groups is that fully costing out a project at the start and before really getting started is really crucial to its success. So we've also been looking at identifying all the potential cost categories over a project lifetime and summarizing them into a costing tool. This can vary by standard, but it's hopefully still helpful at the scoping phase. Another one of the project outputs is a set of 4 case studies which aim to produce different ecosystem-specific examples of selling carbon credits from a restoration project. So to do this, we had in-depth conversations with ELP projects and others about their experience and sort of put these together into these case studies. So the goal was to identify various ecosystem and project-specific barriers and challenges, as well as methodologies which could be used to quantify and market their carbon. So specifically, we looked at steppe grassland, temperate forest, bog peatland, as well as seagrass and salt marsh habitats. So these are represented in the ELP projects, as you can see from photos, which are from the Kakheti Steppes in Georgia, Carpathian Mountains Project, Cairngorms Connect, and the Selensky Seascape. So these case studies highlight some habitat-specific complexities of entering the carbon market, and the fact that some European habitats aren't yet able to engage due to the barriers remaining too high. So in particular, the market for blue carbon is underdeveloped in Europe. So in place of a case study, we've provided an overview of the regional schemes that are emerging and being piloted in Europe, as well as practical experiences from projects elsewhere. These case studies are also intended as a form of knowledge sharing, as some BLP projects experience in selling carbon credits would be an opportunity to look at costs and benefits as well in a real life example. Bless you. Great, and I'll just pass over to Sally now.
Hi there, yeah, I'm Sally Ashby. I'm a climate and conservation finance specialist at Flora and Fauna. So yeah, just to break down a bit of the financing, which can at times be quite confusing and opaque because there's not much sharing of financial agreements, but hopefully I can give you some insights. There is actually a lot of finance potentially available to invest, whether that be in the form of loans or equity, but the real challenge is matching the finance needs of your project with those. Sometimes that can be in terms of scale, but also more crucially, as I explain, you know, it's about structuring that finance so that it makes sense for your project and you're not sort of underselling your project. Some investors won't even engage, you know, early on. They need the project to be at an advanced stage of design or development before they'll look at investing, but that is changing. And there is a sort of bottleneck in terms of being able to get over that feasibility stage of projects. And obviously a shortage of more flexible or philanthropic finance to get to that sort of once you've done your feasibility stage. The key issue really is about not exposing yourselves to risk. Those on the ground implementing the work really don't want to expose themselves to financial risk at that feasibility stage. So either you want to be looking at flexible funding or you work with an investor that can take that upfront risk for you, and obviously with beneficial terms moving forward. The really key thing that investors are looking at in terms of their sort of the bankability depends on those projected cash flows and risk profiles that's linked to your costings and your projected revenues. So it's really key to have an insight into that before you engage with any kind of investor. And obviously the technical feasibility is critical to that too. Really what you're looking to understand as a project before you get involved in terms of commercial finance is your project margins. So really that's having a really clear sense of your costs, like Megan said, over the lifetime of your project, but also the projected revenues, which is linked to understanding your credit volumes and the time frame of those. So that you really need to have an understanding of that at the feasibility stage. These things can be highly subjective. There's a lot of estimates. You obviously want to be working in a range of, you know, from low to high kind of modeling of potentially costs and also revenues. But yeah, you need to have a good understanding of credit volumes over time, the costs of implementation, the costs of the finance and the risks. And like I say, there's not a one size fits all. There are lots of different ways that you can structure finance for development. And really it's about projects having agency and understanding. So if you have that insight into your costs and your potential cash flow and revenue, then you have a greater ability to negotiate. And I think that's really critical. And it is a business. So it is about negotiating. And I think that's why having communities like this and support from other groups and other NGOs is really critical. Next slide, please. So yeah, there are many different investors, and they treat the feasibility stage differently. Like I said, some won't engage at that stage, but others will fund the feasibility work on varying terms. Like I say, in order to, the key thing is not exposing yourself to risk at that stage. So in an ideal world, philanthropic funding is still the most ideal for pre-feasibility and feasibility. However, what you are seeing in the market now is corporate buyers increasingly seeking to invest in building that supply of high quality credits. And like's been said, potentially from specific geographies or ecosystems of interest, and often that's linked with a narrative that those corporate buyers want to buy into. And so in that respect, you've got the potential for bilateral agreements with corporate buyers, and they may be willing to and interested in funding that feasibility stage, and then beyond that, the development work, if it's feasible, to acquire credits. Obviously, there's also the funding in terms of debt or equity, and some of these can be on much larger scales, but there is this sort of missing middle gap where you're now seeing people kind of pooling projects in order to gain that sometimes the level of scale that some of these institutional investors and things need. But that this can be suitable for project development, but obviously, again, it'll be depending on the investor and the fund or whatever, the terms will vary. Often they're banks, investment funds, but also what we're seeing now in the market is commercial project developers so there's a sort of transition from just pure carbon consultancy into these project developers and even brokers at larger scales. So again, it's about really what fits for your project. For example, there are pros and cons to debt and equity finance, in terms of consistency of knowing your sort of what you have to pay back and when, versus level of control over your project. If you're looking at equity, then it's how much you want to sort of hand over control to an investor or funder. But yeah, those things you have to sort of decide for yourselves and your project. But certainly you've got to bear in mind the pros and cons, and certainly the timeframes, because it's a lot more complex when you're looking at larger timeframes. Next slide, please. So obviously the sort of, the investment for development can be very separate to what is ultimately, say, an offtake or long-term purchase agreement, for example, say with a corporate buyer. So these offtake agreements or long-term purchase agreements are basically the framework, the contractual framework for the purchase of the credits. And they tend to be based on either a fixed or a floating price for carbon, as long as up to sort of 10 years or more. Floating prices are preferable given the volatility of the market, but it also, you can contractually, you could say, sort of write in a specific periodical review period, and you have a sort of mixture of fixed and floating price. So yeah, for example, you might want to review over 5 years. And that, again, it's where you could sort of, how do you project the future and the price of carbon? But again, there are sort of ranges in which we anticipate the price of carbon and where it's going. So in terms of repayments for investments, there's lots of different sort of structures, and like I say, lots of people don't want to share their specific financial agreements, but these just give you some examples, like credit shares, like a percentage of credits over a number of years. Some are referred to as volumetric hurdles, where you get a certain amount depending on, and once they get that amount, then they exit the agreement. Again, it might be based on just an actual, say, £100,000 worth of credits or whatever, and once they hit that amount, and then they exit, or discount to market. So there are lots of different ways of structuring the finance over time. The key is it needs to match. Obviously, you find the negotiation, the sweet spot that matches needs on both sides. But it has to be, you know, based on a sound financial model, and obviously ensuring your investments affordable and it won't compromise your cash flow. And I think that's again links back to the project margin. You've got to know your margins before you enter into any kind of commercial negotiation. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Yep, and over to Rob.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, so we've heard about how to go about the technical details of this kind of stuff and the potential risks that might occur in terms of financial and practical risks. But there is another potential risk that is available or present, and that's the risk of what other people or wider society thinks about what you're doing and how that affects your reputation as an organization. And there are lots of different opinions on this, but there are some general rules and thoughts about how you might mitigate these risks, and different types of risks. So I'll start with the risk that may be to your reputation from engaging in voluntary carbon markets at all, and particularly the allegations of greenwashing, and particularly brought to a head recently the article published in The Guardian. You've probably seen this with the fuss associated with Vera certified RED Plus credits, stemming from this article in The Guardian, which was essentially claiming that 90% of the credits issued so far from these projects on avoiding deforestation were effectively worthless because the threat of deforestation had been vastly overstated. Now, there are a lot of arguments about technical aspects of their analyses, how valid they are, and interpretation of other people's analyses, which I'm not going into here. But I will say that this argument partially stems from a philosophical or political dislike of carbon credits and the commodification of nature, especially in this offsetting context. And also, this probably has less to do with any credits that could be or are being generated from restoration, where any deforestation or degradation has already happened. So there can be absolutely no doubt about the risk of deforestation happening because it's already happened. But there are wider political issues around this and the commodification of nature. However, this general risk, as long as you are not philosophically opposed to the commodification of nature and the availability of an existing funding stream for the greater good, this risk probably easily mitigated by a combination of mitigating some of the other risks that we'll discuss in a minute. And because essentially this community is engaged in the business of ecological restoration and not purely carbon restoration. And therefore the credits that we may produce can and should be seen as a co-benefit and a means to an end. So whether or not you generate carbon credits, you will be generating ecological benefit and probably socioeconomic benefit as well. And this brings me on to the idea of how carbon credits relate to the idea of nature-based solutions to climate change, and the idea that not all credits are the same. So a project that's focused not just on providing climate benefits, but on societal conservation ecosystem service benefits such as ecological restoration at a landscape scale, is more likely to embody the values of true nature-based solutions. And there's various bits of work by the Oxford Martin School, by IUCN and the like, putting true nature-based solutions in context and giving some guidelines as to what they should and shouldn't offer. So to provide climate benefits whilst also delivering conservation and equitable societal benefits. And in doing so, it will not only provide high quality credits with added value, but will likely mitigate at least some of these philosophical or political risks to reputation of engaging with the carbon markets. So dealing with reputable standards, subscribing either as part of those standards or additionally voluntarily to the principles behind equitable nature-based solutions, and engaging in all this in a transparent way and performing due diligence, as we've already heard, with regard to both buyers and brokers. So it's not just you doing the right thing, but the people who are helping you and the people you are selling to all doing the right thing, so that you can be seen transparently to not be doing the things that lead to reputational risk. And so part of that, the risks to reputation of failure of due diligence. And what I mean by that is you can just go in with your eyes shut, sell to the people offering you the best price, etc., etc. And turns out you sold to an organization who is effectively indulging in conservation colonialism. There is inequitable land tenure. There is using the credits to offset climate pollution that could be preventable. So one of the chief objections to carbon credits is the assumption that they're being used as a way of polluting businesses carrying on with their polluting activity at no real cost to themselves, because it's cheaper than switching away from carbon emissions, and appearing to have no environmental cost. Essentially allegations of greenwashing whilst continuing business as usual. And the idea that you might be able to fly or drive as much as you like, and by buying some credits, that somehow disappears as far as the atmosphere is concerned. It doesn't really, but the lack of transparency gives it that impression. And this has rightly been perceived to be subverting the idea behind the credits, potentially to be fraudulent, and to actively potentially deter the carbonisation that we need to occur alongside nature-based solutions in order to actually cool or prevent the climate warming as much as it potentially will do. To some extent, some of these are true. People do this. There have been big scandals about this kind of stuff, with petrol companies saying, offset your journey. Well, the quickest way to not have any climate influence of your journey is to not make it, not to trade in some essential buying off of guilt. So to ensure high quality MBS style credits are only sold to individuals and organisations that are set on real verifiable low carbon paths, most of these offsetting and greenwashing allegations can be mitigated. And by doing more and more of that, you might argue that doing so will actually raise the standards within the whole of the voluntary carbon market. People will say, why should I buy low quality credits with no additional benefits, where for a little bit more, I can be certain that I am actually doing some good and not doing some bad. So due diligence, not only in the choice of standard verifying bodies and brokers, on the supply side, but also on the demand side of buyers who are committed to offsetting only those emissions they can't avoid, will all mitigate against allegations of evading and abetting greenwash. And then last of all, you get the risks to your reputation of basically messing it up, of producing incorrect or poor quality credits because you're not adhering to the Chancellor standards. And again, due diligence and employing the right people and engaging in a logical series of steps to make sure you're making the right decisions can mitigate that kind of thing. So as a set of guiding principles for the things we've talked about, properly modelling the costs and income of a project over its entire lifetime is crucial to not only succeeding, but also producing high quality credits and mitigating criticism. The costs will vary by standard, by ecosystem, by project size and geographic location. So there's no one size fits all. But doing thorough due diligence is crucial to project success and improving your reputation. Understanding the legal and policy aspects of your location, the risks and barriers of engaging with markets, and developing a successful project can help projects avoid pitfalls further down the line. So doing the work beforehand will always save you time and pain. Legal and land tenure requirements can complicate the process, particularly where there are multiple landowners involved or where projects occur on public land. Similarly, if you consult local stakeholders and ensure that you have maximum buy-in from them and that an appropriate benefit sharing mechanism in place, i.e. equity, is a crucial step. If everybody wants this to happen, it's more likely to happen. So we've demonstrated a large number of barriers and potential risks, but this isn't trying to discourage you, it's trying to say that, yes, be aware of the risks, but there are ways of mitigating them, and proper planning can ensure that most of these aren't a problem. So you know where the pitfalls are and you can avoid them. And there are a lot of new intermediaries such as brokers or project developers coming into the markets all the time, and it can be necessary to engage with them. And some of them will, the good ones will add value to a project, but their fees are often mysterious and can reduce your final sales and the money which will actually go to restoration in the project itself. Therefore, it's important that you're confident in who you're engaging with and searching out intermediaries who make a big deal of being transparent about their services and their fees, and they're actually aligned with the values of your project, which is, I'd say, a vital step. And finally, much of the criticisms around the voluntary carbon market is, as we've said, in regard to corporate greenwashing, where possible. We'd always encourage you to do your due diligence on the people who are going to buy this and ensure that they have done work within their own organisation to establish a pathway to reducing their emissions and proper decarbonisation, and therefore who are willing to pay a high price for the credits and have a genuine interest in its success, not just in terms of the co-benefits, but real climate benefit as well.